Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, an episode on Iranian political parties. So today's episode was requested by Fan Fanatic on YouTube. If you want me to do another country's political parties, please either comment it down below, send me an email, send me a message on Patreon for my patrons, shout out to them and especially Danny Brown by the way, or send me a request on my feedback and request form in the description. I currently have requests to do Armenian parties, Mexican parties, Czech parties, Iraqi parties, Singaporean parties, Swedish parties, Lithuanian parties, Finnish parties, Greenlandic parties, Latvian parties, and many more. So Iran is typically defined as a government run under an undemocratic theocracy, with its military and religious leaders lording over the population with unchecked power. This analysis seems to not be far from reality, but it is more complicated than that. Iran is uniquely an Islamic republic, with democratic elections and values intertwined with Islamic, particularly a certain branch of Shia Twelver thought and ideals. There are regular elections in the country to parliament and for president. However, a very large chunk of political power lays with officials unelected by the people who, especially at the top levels of government, are able to dominate and create policy with limited to non-existent reliance on elected politicians. Iran allows anyone to run for office, with the initial registration actually being pretty open. In the 2017 presidential election, almost 1,700 people filed to run for president of Iran. However, candidates have to be vetted by the Guardian Council, a council made up of 12 members who are largely answerable to the supreme leader, the de facto ruler of the country who has the final say on most national policy decisions. The Guardian Council will weed out any candidates who are unknown to the general public, and any candidates who they deem to not be devoutly loyal to the Islamic Republic of Iran. This weeding out of candidates is very common, with most candidates who file for candidacy being rejected. Often the Guardian Council is accused of being very politically motivated in their vetting process, being accused of frequently weeding out any who criticize the status quo or even just the ruling political class too much. Iran's politics are divided between two main camps. There are the conservatives, those who side with the status quo and either are loyal towards the supreme leader or at the very least loyal towards Iran's conservative social policies. Then there are the Reformists, those who want change in the country and can range from those who seek moderate alterations in the country, all the way to those who outright want to see the status quo overturned. Although these more radical reformists are non-existent at higher levels due to candidate vetting. One might think that Iran's political camps are divided between two organized political parties, a conservative party and a reformist party. Maybe there's a smaller third middle ground party or an extremist party on the fringe. However, Iran's politics are not centered on parties at all. Political parties do exist, but they seem to be fairly hazy groups. It seems most politicians, when running for office, don't run under Party A or Party B. They instead run under electoral blocs that are typically made up of either reformist or conservatives. But these pacts tend to disappear quickly after the election, with a whole new electoral pact replacing them shortly afterwards for the next election. So this episode isn't going to have the traditional party episode structure, but they will be divided between talking about the political camps more broadly. Iran's main legislative body is the Majlis. The Majlis is made up of 290 representatives from 208 different electoral districts in Iran. The districts will vary considerably, with some having only one representative, elected from a simple two-round voting system, while others, the largest centered in Tehran, has around 30 representatives, and that has a more complicated two-round voting system. Importantly, 5 candidates are reserved for Iran's non-Muslim minorities, with 1 seat for Armenians in the north of the country, 1 for Armenians in the south of the country, 1 for Syrians, 1 for Zoroastrians, and 1 for Iran's Jewish community. The Majlis will vote on rules and regulations, can call for an investigation into government entities, sign treaties, and approve of the president's cabinet. However, the Majlis' power is severely weakened both by the Guardian Council, who can ensure only certain representatives are allowed to run, and other forces in the country who can override and bypass the Majlis and other elected officials in the country. So let's begin talking about the camps. First, we have the dominant force, the conservatives. The conservatives are, as the name suggests, conservative, supporting the status quo. Because they are, or at least most of the time they are, friendly with the supreme leader, judiciary, and leading Shia clerics in the country, they tend to de facto run politics in the country. Even in electoral institutions, they can actually do very well, with it right now holding the majority of seats in the Majlis. The conservatives are divided between several different factions, ranging from hardliners devoutly loyal to the supreme leader and backing him unconditionally, to conservatives who support the status quo but are willing to entertain some level of reform. Broadly, all conservatives are very sympathetic towards the role Islam plays in Iranian politics. However, one faction, led by former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, while often labeled as a part of the conservative camp due to its social conservatism and anti-American politics, tends to not emphasize Islam as much and are actually somewhat hostile towards the supreme leader and the traditional clerics. Besides getting a lot of support among traditional clerics, conservatives electorally tend to do well among more religious Shia Iranians, among ethnic Persians, those in rural areas, particularly in eastern Iran, and in Iran's conservatives have several different political organizations. Some powerful groups include the Combat Clergy Association, a group dedicated to fighting for an Islamic Iran, with former presidents Ibrahim Raisi and Akbar Rafsanjani being members of the group. There's the Islamic Coalition, a conservative force tied to businessmen in the country, the Stability of Islamic Revolution Front, a radical Ahmadinejad loyalist front, the Society of Samaritan Teachers of a group of conservative Shia clerics from the Islamic Society of Engineers, a group of conservative/Islamist engineers, and finally, there is the Progress and Justice Population of Islamic Iran, a moderate conservative group based around Mohammad Baghber Ghalibaf, the current speaker of the Majlis. Iran's conservatives are like conservatives in many parts of the world, socially conservative, hawkish on foreign policy, and generally oppose a social market economy. They support the status quo on social issues, wanting to maintain Islamic values in Iranian society, opposing greater women or LGBTQ rights, supporting a strong army and Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, wants to restrict political dissent in the country, and wants the supreme leader, the judiciary, and the unelected bodies to continue to maintain a large degree of power in Iran. Economically, the conservatives are somewhat divided, with some favoring a more laissez-faire economic model backing privatization and more connection with global trade, while others, namely the hardliners and those friendly with Ahmadinejad, supporting more populist economic policies, wanting a strong welfare state and more government investment. On foreign policy, the conservatives stand pretty firmly opposed to American involvement in the Middle East and is strongly anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. They also generally tend to support countries like Russia, China, Syria, and Venezuela, while opposing states like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Afghanistan under the Taliban. The conservatives are so dominant in Iranian politics, they are viewed as the status quo, and those who dislike the status quo in Iran almost immediately point their finger at them. They are seen by opponents of the Iranian government as backwards theocrats, proponents of Iranian interference in terrorism in the Middle East, backers of a shadow government in the form of the IRGC and the clerics, undemocratic autocrats, defenders of a broken system in need of serious reform, and/or patriarchal sexist. Any complaints people have at the Iranian state will also be directed at them due to their connections with the supreme leader and other powerful institutions in Iran. Members of the conservative faction are also accused of corruption and engaging in Holocaust denialism. All this has made the Iranian conservatives pretty disliked. While some individual members of the conservative faction do have a support base, and it seems the more hardcore conservative faction have been growing in strength online, the conservatives overall are a pretty weak electoral force. They essentially require the Guardian Council to exclude reformist candidates from making it on the ballot, and turn out to be low in order to win elections. They aren't without supporters, but on a fair playing field, it seems the conservatives would at best be pretty weakened, to at worst being swept away from its commanding position in Iran. So now we go to the rivals of the conservatives, the Reformists. Like the conservatives, there isn't any one kind of reformer, but they generally want Iran's politics to become more democratic, and Iran to move away from the status quo. While the reformers do go all the way to quasi-supporters of liberal democracy, who stop just short of calling for the current political structure to be overturned, pretty much all reformist politicians, and even a very large chunk of their support base, are fully in favor of maintaining the current political structure of Iran, just wanting reforms and alterations to the system. I think a good way to think about it is if the conservatives want to emphasize the Islamic aspect of Iran's Islamic Republic, then the reformers want to emphasize the Republic aspect of Iran's Islamic Republic. The Iranian reformers did historically have some successes, with reformers Mohammad Khatami and Hassan Rouhani holding the presidency from 1997 to 2005 and 2013 to 2021 respectively. However, after Rouhani left office, as I'll talk about a bit later, they suffered a downward spiral, losing a lot of its elected figures. They, this latest election, in a bit of a shock, managed to elect Masoud Peshkan, a minister from Khatami's government, into the presidency, which may be a sign they are resurgent, but we will have to see. The reformers generally tend to do well among several different groups in Iran, namely young people, college students, minorities, particularly Azeris, Balochis, Sunni Muslims, Kurds, and Turkmen, those in urban areas, and especially in Tehran, and among dissident clerics. Iran's reformists, like the conservatives, are divided between several different organizations. You have the Association of Combat Clerics, the reformist mirror to the Combat Clergy Association, being made up of reformist-minded clerics with Khatami as a key figure, the Democracy Party, an Islamic Democratic Party, the Islamic Labor Party and Workers' House, two organizations based on fighting for workers' rights, the Executives of Construction Party, a moderate conservative party, the Islamic Association of Teachers of Iran, a reformist group based around school teachers, and the Moderation and Development Party, a centrist party affiliated with Rouhani. The reformists favor a more open Iran and a dovish foreign policy. While the big tent nature of the reformist camp make the scale and scope of the reformist policy difficult to exactly pinpoint, reformers are generally sympathetic towards giving more power to the president, the majlis, and more democratically elected institutions, support a more pluralistic Iran, oppose a strict enforcement of religious laws, backs greater women's rights, and wants more autonomy for minority groups and their languages. While the reformists are opposed to Israel and generally criticize the U.S. for its involvement in the Middle East, they do favor rapprochement with the United States, wanting more dialogue between Iran and America, backing a nuclear deal between the two, and favors Iran becoming more involved in the wider international community. Economically, the reformists are a bit more divided, with some like Khatami favoring economic liberalism, while others favor a strong welfare state and a reduction in the wealth gap like Rouhani. I had mentioned earlier that after Rouhani's presidency, there was a weakening of the reformist camp. People became disillusioned with the camp, and you saw in elections after 2020 a very big drop-off in turnout and a drop in reformist victories, with a sense that the reformists had failed to really change the country and were poor at governing. I think there are three explanations for why Iranians turned away from the reformist camp. First, there is the view that is sympathetic towards the reformers. While the reformers tried to carry out reform, they were hampered by the conservatives, who still held a lot of unelected power, and they prevented any reformist policy goals from being carried out, and barred many popular reformist figures from running. The reformers could have changed Iran, but they were stopped and therefore people turned away from them. The next two explanations are more critical towards them. There is the unsympathetic look at the reformers, but sympathetic look at the Islamic Republic. The reformers lost their support base because the Iranian people realized they didn't know what they were doing. The reformers too often pushed for reforms that went against the supreme leader and were seen as un-Islamic, which obviously wasn't going to fly. The reformers attempted to work with the Americans on the nuclear deal, but were naive on the Americans, who were never going to uphold their end of the bargain. When Trump was elected in 2016, the nuclear deal the reformers had pushed so hard for was torn up, and sanctions were re-established, hurting the Iranian economy. And I suspect some conservatives may even feel that certain reformist figures are outright controlled by America, or aligned with outlawed opposition groups, considering its more socially liberal policies and dovish policy. This all made the Iranian people turn away from Rouhani and embrace the conservatives in the most recent election. Finally, there is the unsympathetic look at the reformers and the Islamic Republic. Yes, the conservatives may have undermined the reformist efforts, but the reformers were stupid to have not expected that. The Iranian government cannot be reformed from the inside. While the reformists want a democratic Iran, most of them still want to maintain the Islamic Republic, which many in the Iranian opposition view as monstrous. Iranians who wanted to see change realized that the reformists couldn't bring about any change, and thus gave up on participating in Iranian politics. All three of these views have different explanations for the reformist slump, but they all do acknowledge that the reformists are much weakened. While the election of Pezeshkian may be a sign things may turn a corner for the reformists, the fact of the matter is the reformists are going to have an uphill battle in winning back the Iranian people and achieving its policy goals. So those are the above-board approved factions in Iran. But before we end, I thought I'd briefly talk about some of the illegal/underground groups present in the country. First, there are the radical reformers/Democrats, people who, like the reformers, want democratic change to Iran, but are seen by the authorities as too extreme, so they're outlawed. Among these are those affiliated with the Green Movement. The movement was formed after the 2009 election, which had accusations of electoral fraud, and was headed by Khatami. How relevant the movement is now is unclear, although with protests in 2022 over the death of Mahsa Amini, it's almost certain a decent chunk of the Iranian public are at least sympathetic towards the radical reformers. Other underground groups include the Nationalist. They can range from groups like the National Front, which can trace its origins to the 40s and embraces a liberal democracy with center-left economics, to the Pan-Iranians Party, which is a quasi-fascist party that can also trace its origins to the 40s and was a pan-Iranian empire. These days, some of the more powerful opposition forces in Iran are among the ethnic minorities of the country. These organizations can range from pressure groups wanting more autonomy to full-on pro-independence militant groups waging war against Iran. Perhaps most famously are the Kurds, with groups like the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, Komela, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, and the Kurdistan Freedom Party, with leftist thought often being tied with Kurdish nationalism and several being labeled as terrorist groups by Iran. The Baluchi people also have a very large number of opposition groups, with it ranging from autonomous like the Baluchistan People's Party to Sunni Islamist, like Jaish al-Adl, which have carried out several attacks in the region. Opposition groups also exist for the Azeri, Turkmen, Lurs, and the Arab population of Khuzestan. The next opposition movements mostly operate outside Iran, and their influence in Iran ranges from unclear to almost certainly non-existent. You have liberals calling for liberal democracy in Iran, like the Iran Revival Organization. There are various left-leaning groups ranging from social democrats to communist, with groups like the Iranian People's Fedayeen Guerrillas, the Communist Party of Iran, and the Tuda Party, being some of the largest. There's also the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or PMOI, which could debatably also be lumped in with the other leftist groups. It's a very colorful party. It was formed in the 60s, and waged a guerrilla war with other left-wing groups against the Shah until the Iranian Revolution when it turned against the Islamic Republic. It was actively involved in Ba'athist Iraq, aiding Saddam in the Iran-Iraq War, and in crushing dissent in the country in 1991. It has now set up a compound in Albania, received vocal support from several American and European conservative figures, is accused of brainwashing its members, and its leader hasn't been seen in several years. The PMOI is pretty controversial, even among the opposition, and is seen by a decent chunk of its detractors as a cult. Finally, the last major branch of the Iranian opposition in exile are the monarchists. They argue for a return to the Pahlavi dynasty that ruled Iran from 1925 to 1979, before the Iranian Revolution. They tend to support a liberal constitution, with Reza Pahlavi as the new Shah. Finally, before we end our talk of the opposition, I'll just say pretty much all of these groups are accused of being puppets of the US and aided by CIA money and weapons. So in conclusion, there are two main factions in Iran: the conservatives, who support the status quo, the supreme leader, and the Islamic and IRGC institutions that dominate the state, and the reformers, who want a more democratic Iran and more power to move towards elected politicians. There are several ideologically diverse opposition groups that do play a role in influencing Iranian politics, but they tend to be pretty obscure. Iranian politics is very fascinating, with political parties existing, but not really being that important in understanding Iranian politics, at the very least from the big picture. If you want to understand personalities and kind of go through a more fine-tooth comb, it's more important to understand them there, but if you're looking at it from like a bird's eye picture, it's not as big. But yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, I hope you all enjoyed. After this, I will do an episode on Armenian political parties. That one should be out relatively soon. I think that one's going to be relatively shortish. Then I will do the history of Croatia, and then I will do Mexican political parties. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.